You're listening to Wild Things and Wild Places, a Muley Fanatic Foundation podcast that aims to discuss issues and efforts related to the Muley Fanatic Foundation mission, the conservation of mule deer, furthering the sport of hunting, and sound wildlife management.
Everybody knows I'm a Muley fanatic.
It's time for Wild Things and Wild Places. And here's your guide, Joshua Coursey.
Hey everybody, Dave Willms here. Different kind of intro today. We are doing a joint collaboration with Josh Coursey at the Muley Fanatic Foundation. Nephi Cole is here as well as always. And Josh Coursey, we're the Your Mountain podcast. Josh, why don't you tell us about your podcast? And we're doing this together because we have similar interests here. We're aligned on wanting to talk about an issue tonight.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea that we could do this. Thanks for the idea last week when we visited. I think you're a seasoned veteran in some regards to the podcast platform. We're fairly new. The Muley Fanatic Foundation launched our Wild Things and Wild Places on July. So we've only got a handful, 13 of these. They come out every Tuesday. We've got a few of these under our belt. But I thought with your concern and Nephi in the medium that you have been able to utilize this podcast platform to talk about an array of issues, I thought this would be great for us collaboratively to talk about an issue that has, quite frankly, got a bunch of people up in arms.
Almost literally in some sense. I've heard of actual death threats over some of what we're going to talk about. It's been fascinating to watch this develop. Before we talk about the specifics of it, maybe for our listeners, it would benefit our listeners to know some of your background, Josh, as the president and CEO and co-founder of the Muley Fanatic Foundation. Provide some background context, what you're all about, some about you. I'd love for our listeners to learn more about you here before we really get into the meat.
No, I appreciate that, David. The Muley Fanatic Foundation is a grassroots conservation organization that Joey Fagel and I started in 2011. We're headquartered in Southwest Wyoming, based out of Green River is where our office is. And really the design and the whole premise and the impetus for why we started the foundation was to be able to make a difference that could be measured by the fruit of your own labor. And when I say that, we had spent 5 years with a different organization for mule deer conservation. And essentially the responsibilities were very simple. Host an annual event, raise a lot of money, send the money back to their national or corporate headquarters, and then do that again the following year. And it became Groundhog Day for us, if you will. 5 years of doing that, generating almost $600,000. Bean counter by trade could not account for much more than 12.2% of those funds to go back onto the ground in Wyoming. And it's not that we didn't care about deer in Gunnison, Colorado, or Boise, Idaho. We just thought there's got to be a different model, something different that we can be doing, that the folks that are willing to support conservation in Wyoming, it was where our focus was. We're Wyoming natives, born and raised, short of some time in the service and then finishing up my undergrad work. I've been in Wyoming almost all my life, and this is where I really wanted to make an impact, and that's where Joey's heart was as well. And so we got with an attorney and accountant friend of ours, and we established a 501c3 with a different model, and that was, if we expanded to chapters would retain 70% of the funds that they raised at their annual event, 30% would come back to headquarters, and then through an all-volunteer project allocation committee, they would put those 70% dollars that they retained in a local bank in their community to local projects in their backyard, where they truly could measure the fruit of their own labor. And so fast forward 12 years later, we've got 17 chapters. It now spans 7 states, including a state like Virginia, where they don't even have mule deer, that has generated a significant amount of money in their 4 years of activity. And the nice thing about an effort like that is it's conservationists that live on the eastern seaboard, but recognize that they want to come out west and they want to help mule deer. And so they operate just like our chapters out west. They raise money. They allocate it as an all-volunteer committee to projects that they review that are submitted to them from western states. And it's just a different model, and it's working for us. And this issue, what we're about to dive into, it's very similar. It's an issue that really has impact for everybody.
What is it about mule deer? Why does everybody want to hunt mule deer? Let's be honest, there's lots of whitetail deer. How come everybody wants to hunt a muley?
And right now, I would like for you to hunt whitetail.
The second question, yeah. And then the second question is, how do you find them? That's the second question. But first one's first. Why does everybody want
It is truly. You don't have to take my word for it. It's like the sandhill crane. If you Google ribeye of the sky, that's what pops up. And if you Google the icon of the American West, that's what comes up is the mule deer. Believe it or not, it's not a feral horse. It is the mule deer. And mule deer, I'm telling you, are just, there's something about them that's majestic. And Nephi, I know you know this. I know you're being facetious, but yeah. What, the call of an elk in September on a cool, crisp morning, that's magical. But you can get that every year. Finding that 200-inch, 220-inch mule deer, how rare is that? You got to earn it. And a guy will go his lifetime and maybe not get there, but he still has something to chase. You'll chase a bugle every fall, right?
I'm sitting looking at you, Josh, right now and wondering if you've ever succeeded in a mule deer hunt, because all I see are elk racks on your wall.
Yeah,
you seem to be really good.
I am doing my part to help mule deer by killing elk.
Earlier, and I told you I bought my 13-year-old. He picked up his tag today, his deer tag. I was talking about when I said, yeah, we're going to go out and hunt. And I said, don't worry, we intend to take nothing but white-tailed does, tons of them. We're just going to, do everything we can. If you want to do something good for deer everywhere, this goes to all of our listeners. I'm serious. Go shoot some whitetails. It literally is good for CWD. It's good for habitat. It's good. Everybody's going to be happy.
The landowner, you name
it.
Yep.
Yeah. Do us all a favor.
Mule deer is where it's at for us. They're certainly a species that there's no shortage of work that needs to be done for mule deer. I think they're a fascinating critter. Certainly there's probably some magic that because it is such a Western iconic ungulate species that you can read about in the journals of the Corps of Discovery with Lewis and Clark, and just the awe and the amazement of this as its own individual deer compared to whitetail, as you mentioned. They're unique and they're special, but they've taken it on the chin. They have been for the last 3 decades. And the decline is not immune to any of the Western states. All the Western states are reporting a significant decline. And then you couple that with a winter like we had this year in Western Wyoming and northern part of Utah and Idaho and even northwest Colorado. Mule deer have just really taken it. And it's like anything. You can sit on the sidelines and you can watch it and complain about it, or you can be frustrated or irritated, or you can say, you know what, let's put our gloves on and get our boots on and let's go to work. And that's what we're doing. And we're just a vessel that brings a lot of people with the same concern together to be able to go out and do good work.
And I can tell you do great work. It's been fun I remember this was years ago. I was working for the Attorney General's office representing the state engineer's office. And I remember getting on an elevator and seeing flyers for the first ever Muley Fanatic Foundation banquet. And I had to ask somebody, fortunately, there was somebody there at the state engineer's office that had a pretty good knowledge about what you were up to. But who are these guys? Where did they come from? And in the course of about a year, went from who are these guys, where did they come from, to holy smokes, look at all this stuff that these guys are doing, and going towards becoming one of the predominant conservation organizations in the state almost overnight. It was really neat to see. I've been watching and admiring you from afar since the genesis of this thing, and it's fun to be able to sit down and talk with you about some of this stuff today.
Those are the kindest words I've ever heard, David. I appreciate that. It's very humbling for you to say that. Really is beyond my vocabulary, other than to say, just know it is a huge effort of a lot of people. There's not one or two individuals. It is a team effort, and it really just comes down to people that ultimately want to quantify their involvement with, did I make a difference? Some sort of a standard or a barometer of measurement to know that it was worth the equity of your time, the greatest asset we have. And so, yeah, thanks for that, man. I really do appreciate that. It was pretty cool of you to say.
Oh, no, it's easy to say. I don't want to drop names because I don't want people's egos to get too big. But I could tell you there's one gentleman, I'll do it. Sure, Nephi knows him. But there's one guy way back at the beginning that really gave me a bunch of background information about why you were doing what you're doing. And that was Matt Hubler. I don't know if you...
Yeah.
I thought Matt was in prison by now. Matt's not.
He's on parole.
Yeah,
he can listen to the internet. I didn't think he could use computers again yet, but whatever.
So you have this, I'm going to call it a meteoric rise in the conservation community in Wyoming, and you're based in Southwest Wyoming with this heavy focus on mule deer and mule deer habitat, and you referenced the horrible winter that we just had this past year. That I've seen some accounts of 100% fawn loss from last year's fawn crop, and overall herd declines in some units of maybe even 70 to 80%. And then so you take that, and that's all in your neck of the woods. And now what we're here to talk about really is the planning, the Bureau of Land Management's planning efforts to set the course for how these lands that these mule deer in Southwest Wyoming rely on, and everything else too, and people in industries and the economy of not just Southwest Wyoming, but the state of Wyoming, these lands that everybody relies on. There's this big planning process, what the priorities for management on these lands will be for the next several decades. And I was wondering if you might set the stage a little bit for this discussion with some of the background of the planning in the area. What I know, just to tee it up a little bit, the controversy around this proposed, and it's a resource management plan, this draft resource management plan, the controversy around it is unlike anything I've ever seen in my professional career in this state. And I'd start it with that. It landed, I don't know what metaphor you want to use.
Ton of bread. It wasn't like it landed softly and everybody liked it. That's not the.
There have been public meetings with waiting room, like people waiting to get in. It feels like people are out there carrying pitchforks to attack the Bureau of Land Management over this. Before we get to the details of this plan and maybe busting some myths of what are out there, talk to us a little bit about planning, resource management planning in the Rock Springs area.
That's a good setup, David. I think in regards to the planning, what's important to note is that this process has spanned the efforts of some local and some state-based conservation organizations to form a coalition, knowing that this planning was about to get underway and the importance of it. There's a little bit of history, I think, that sets the stage of why maybe this has been met with such passion and emotion. The current RMP, the Resource Management Plan, or the gospel or playbook that is being operated to manage this 3.6 million acres of landscape, we're operating out of a playbook that was last signed a record of decision in 1997. And so when you look at Western Wyoming and you think about what has occurred since 1997, I think especially the boom of what you've seen with the explosion within the Mesa and the Jonah Fields and the impact that had on the landscape, this is still the same playbook that was allowing for that type of disruption to the landscape, if you will, for lack of better words. And to know that we are now 26 years in the future, and we're going to change that, and we're going to set the course for what potentially could be the next 26 years or 3 decades or whatever long it takes. I think that there's a lot that's been learned. Nobody was talking about directional drilling in 1997. It just wasn't a thing. We weren't talking about no surface occupancy on the landscapes because we have increased technologies that can allow us to be able to still extract without putting that scar into pristine habitats. And so it's important because everybody recognizes a lot has changed since then. Where it's gotten frustrating, in my mind, this effort as a coalition that we formed in 2008 was to be able to do business. And I've heard you actually reference this before, David, but in Wyoming, there's a Wyoming way of doing things. We bring people from all different backgrounds to one table. We break bread together. We may disagree. We may learn a little bit. We may help educate somebody. There's compromise, there's understanding, but there is a way that we do business that allows various interests to be able to come together. And I think Wyoming is unique in that regard. I think that's something that goes well with our greatest resource is our people. We know how to do things the right way that work for us. And this coalition put a lot of effort in doing that exact same. We didn't leave any stone uncovered because we knew something as big as this, with the impact and the duration of time for this to be durable, it was going to take buy-in from everybody to be able to get to this point. And we presented a proposal to the BLM in 2019 after a decade of this effort. And this effort truly had unanimous support and reflected that across the board. And then so when BLM has that and then sits on it, we have a loss. There was certainly a lot of interest in wanting to see this process completed while Trump was in the White House. And then that didn't occur. You get a new administration in the White House, and each administration has their own agenda. And I think it's obvious where each of those lean left or right when it comes to these type of issues. And so now we've got a draft draft proposal with a preferred alternative is just so far out there compared to anything that was presented as a balanced and durable approach that had support by many. And I think that just has gotten us to the point where folks are now starting to pay attention. If you weren't paying attention, you can't miss it now. It's deer this winter. By March and April, everybody was talking about it. And right now, 6 weeks ago, if you'd have polled 10 strangers on the road what RMP was, they probably would have said Rocky Mountain Power. But now everybody knows what it is. And everybody's talking about it because they recognize this is beyond conservation of wildlife. This truly could have a potential impact to the way business is done and the economic impact of not just jobs, but how communities survive in Southwest Wyoming.
We talked about this a little bit before, but we didn't do it. I think it's worth circling back a little bit on this, Rocky. Objective voices on this, because both Dave and I worked for the former governor, Matthew H. Mead, as senior policy advisors for him. And we worked in this area and on these issues. And so we're going to have strong feelings about the right way to do business. And you talked about breaking bread, but both Dave and I have sat with community groups throughout Western Wyoming. And even on the national level, we've worked with large working groups of a variety of stakeholders to come to find solutions on issues like this. The Rock Springs, to me, is surprising in that I was disappointed, and I wrote myself a note because I wanted to say this accurately. The thing that bothers me is not that I don't expect that and we'll talk, Dave's got all the details of this. It's not as much the details of the agency's direction that they're starting out with. That doesn't surprise me that one of the options would be what I would term extreme. What surprises me is that the agency would come back with that as the direction that they're pitching as the way to go. That's what I see as being different. I think typically an agency will have a variety of different alternatives out there. They typically, I believe, try and find some type of a pragmatic center and then argue from there one way or the other. The Rock Springs RMP to me seems like a change in paradigm where I can't help but feel like the starting point here was in itself political, and it bothered me. It still does trouble me a little bit. Dave, what do you think?
Yeah, this is the place where I wonk out just a little bit because I do think in the broader discussion, I've been following the opinion pieces and the reporting on the public meetings and some of the interviews with just the members of the public. One of the things that I guess bothers me is there's this information vacuum that people aren't coming to the conversation at the same place with the same information. And so I think what I wanted to do is provide a little bit of level setting information. And I think this is good, even if you're not from Wyoming, by the way. We have a lot of listeners, I know, for our podcast all over the country that may not care as much about one particular RMP, resource management plan in Southwest Wyoming. But what I'm going to say and what I'm going to talk about could happen in any of your planning processes with federal lands anywhere in the country. So that's why I think there's some value to this. Josh, you mentioned you'd given a proposal in 2019 and you wanted to see this finalized with the Trump administration. One thing that hasn't really been publicized much is, and I've mostly verified this is true, is that the draft RMP that was released is verbatim, word for word, the draft RMP that the Trump administration never released. With the one exception of identifying the preferred alternative as alternative B. But the range of alternatives and all of the language in the entire document was actually put together several years ago, and it was never released to the public for comment. So we're starting off in this place where this administration, they actually didn't go back to the drawing board and bring people back to the table to talk about what their goals and objectives might be and re-engaging collaborators as they move forward with coming up with an RMP, a draft proposal. They just took what had been done. And then there's a reason why they picked alternative B as well. And this goes back to Nephi's point about politics, right? Go back to the campaign trail when President Biden was running for office and the various commitments that he made from a conservation standpoint during that time, climate commitments and commitments to reducing oil and gas leasing or production on public lands and the 30 by 30 initiative, right? There were all of these commitments made on the campaign trail from a conservation standpoint that had to be met. And when you take the the range of alternatives and actually map it out. And you look at alternative D, as in dog, being that middle, sort of the quote unquote middle of the road one, the compromise alternative. When you actually map it out compared to the 1997 RMP, they're looking at that as I don't think we can endorse that as a preferred alternative because it's potentially a net conservation decrease over the 1997, the RMP we're currently operating under. So of the four alternatives, the only thing that has a net conservation gain, which they'd have to do politically, is alternative B. And they can't do the other pieces. Why not just release an RMP and not pick a preferred alternative? Putting all of these alternatives out there, but not pick a preferred. There's actually a federal regulation that requires the BLM to pick a preferred alternative before releasing the draft. So they were obligated by law to select a preferred alternative, and then they were obligated by politics to make it that alternative B, since they didn't go through that process of bringing people back to the table and talking about, okay, what could that compromise alternative look like?
And so everybody's
with their administration.
Sorry, Dave. So everybody's on a page just to understand what we're talking about. Those of you who aren't steeped in the RMP process, that resource management process proposal, putting that together is literally years of meetings. It's years of public meetings and interactions by agency professionals where they're going out and they're sitting down in small groups and working through things. And then behind the scenes, you have agency professionals who are collecting GIS maps, who are doing biological studies. So all this stuff, if you can think about this, it's like volumes of a book, right? You've got this book with chapter after chapter after chapter. And, if this is our Bible, the Bible is done. It's finished. It's sealed. And that's what we're talking about when Dave says they didn't go back out and they didn't create anything new. All that information is there from the Trump administration, undebated. It is where it is. It is what it is. So what's the concern? The end of the chapters of the book, you have the appendix. And if you can think of this, the actual agency decision, the direction that the agency is saying, hey, from all this discussion that we have, here's 5 directions we could go. Direction A, B, C, D, right? Or 4 directions. This decision, the final piece, this is simply picking which bullet.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure it's clear that, before sending the draft out, it's picking which bullet. But as far as what the final RMP looks like, they're not picking a bullet. And I want to make that crystal clear. That's one of the
done yet.
Yes. That's one of the huge misconceptions that's out there. Everything that I'm seeing in the media, the reports, and this is a misconception
Absolutely.
about how RMP planning works. Just because they have a range of alternatives and they have 4 separate alternatives, and just because in the draft they select one as the preferred alternative does not mean
the end of the day. Yeah, that's
does not mean in the final.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah,
the final plan could be could they just pick one of those? They could. Are they likely to? Absolutely not.
Yeah.
They're actually likely to take things from different alternatives and mesh them together. And I almost view it as saying you're almost using this public process to create an alternative E.
That's a very good way to say that, David. And I think that's what we'll end up with, is a very mosaic, hybrid alternative that has a little bit of everything. But I think that what you have been able to convey is that there is a huge misnomer out there that this has just been done since Biden has been in the White House, and that is not accurate. And I'm glad you brought that up. Now, at the same time, I would also think that if this would have come out while Trump was still in the White House, we would have seen a different preferred alternative. And it may have been preferred alternative D as in Delta, but with what you have alluded to and showcased, and I appreciate the background on that with the efforts and the promises that were made while Biden was campaigning, they were backed into a corner to pick alternative B, and that's okay. But alternative B, it is scary. It is absolutely scary. And when you think about the lack of cooperator
Can you talk a little bit about why it's scary?
I think because it is so far beyond what the ask was that was met with so much effort and the longevity of those efforts. There was a ton of equity, as Nephi alluded to. This didn't happen overnight. This happened over a decade and a half, to be exact. And those meetings and the gathering of that intel to compile that information, and then to have something like Alternative B come out that seemed just the use of ACEC as what many were seeing as just a land grab that would allow for some other restrictions to be put in play that would not be if it was under an NSO or a timing stipulation, or even phased leasing, which we've seen in some of the other RMP works in Wyoming and even down into Dinosaur, Colorado. There were some other tools in the toolbox, and B just writes its own tools. And
I hate to interrupt you, but you said a lot of acronyms there.
Yeah, okay.
NSO and ACEC, and I just want to make sure for folks that don't know what those are, maybe you could explain a little bit about some of those.
So NSO, that was a big one for the coalition, and that was no surface occupancy. And that essentially was our recognition of how important energy extraction is in the Cowboy State, and we know how important that is to the communities within Southwest Wyoming. To just come out against energy development or oil and gas just wasn't going to be something that was palatable to people. This is how people make their living. But I do believe people work hard and they want to play hard. And they also recognize that there's some landscapes that we need to stay out of, and we need to be able to keep them pristine for future generations. And when in the big scope of things, the Little Mountain area that the coalition designated, it represents 522,000 acres of the 3.6 million acres. So that's about 15% of the entire RMP. And so using tools like NSO or timing stipulations of when activity could be taking place on that landscape that might overlap with critical winter range or transitional times, migration corridor movement, those were tools that was able to be reached through compromise and understanding. Alternative B, using ACEC, another acronym that I had said, Area of Critical Environmental Concern, that's totally different. That's just basically saying we can't do anything there, and that's not a compromise, and that isn't a way to be able to come to an understanding with maybe an opposing view of how you think this land could be managed. And the increase of ACEC designations within Alternative B compared to what we have now and even what Alternative D offers was so significant that I think it was just the natural reaction for people to see that this is some draconian DC-led effort that's just basically a land grab, and people are going to have to learn to deal with it. And of course, that's going to draw some emotions from folks, as it should. But I do think the background that you've given on the information of how this has been compiled, that it hasn't just been done by the current BLM administration, that is very important to note. That's very important.
Yeah, I'd also, there are a couple other things that you touched on that I'd maybe drill down into just a little bit as well, because that concept of NSO, no surface occupancy, I want to make sure one other piece is clear, because I've seen some reporting about this that I think has been off the mark. I've seen some people complaining that they're equating NSO to no use, period. Like that means they can't hunt there or recreate there or do anything there.
Or ride side by side, et cetera. Yeah, I've seen some of the same.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that no surface occupancy, the ones that affects the most are the extractive industries, wind and solar, the oil and gas, trona, coal, that kind of industry in the state. When you say no surface occupancy for those industries, it means you can't put a drill rig there, you can't put a transmission line through, you can't do in situ mining there, that kind of stuff. Now, there are ways. NSO doesn't mean no use even from those industries. You mentioned earlier in the podcast how 25 years ago we didn't have the 2-mile laterals for oil wells that we have now. There might still be ways to reach some of those minerals in some places, even if there's NSO. But NSO is when you're talking at the level that this alternative is talking, that might make a lot of even those concepts prohibitive for getting some of those resources. But I do want to make sure that folks don't equate NSO to, I can't go hunt mule deer there, because you can, right? Nothing there is going to do that. And then on the other thing I wanted to mention was with the areas of critical environmental concern, because I've heard this argument a couple of times already. And one of the arguments I've heard is Wyoming, the administration cannot use the Antiquities Act in Wyoming, meaning you can't designate a national monument in Wyoming. It was one of the trades that was made at the time Grand Teton National Park became a park, was that unless the state of Wyoming says, let's do this, and I'm really high level saying this, but it's the only way to designate is through congressional designation. You can't, the administration can't come in using the Antiquities Act and create a national monument. And so the argument I've heard is that creating all of these ACECs is the workaround on the Antiquities Act, and where effectively this alternative is creating a new Yellowstone National Park-sized monument. I would say that ACECs are, these areas of critical environmental concern, are a tool that is sometimes used to limit activities. They could have timing steps. They're not necessarily exclusionary in every instance. Sometimes they might say, we have critical elk winter range here, and this ACEC is being set up to protect this elk winter range. And so we're not going to allow you to drive on roads, 2 tracks in the ACEC during this 2-month window when they might be at their most vulnerable, that kind of thing. But it can go all the way to, we're not going to have any leasing of minerals or any development of any kind. What you can do with an ACEC is there is a range of restrictions on use that can be very scalpel focused. I don't know if you want to say shotgun approach, but there's a wide range of how to use them. So I just want to clarify that kind of piece of it too, because there's a lot of information out there that I don't know. There's a lot of hyperbole too, right? And I think it's some of that. The fear is rooted in a lack of knowing how the process works or what these designations might mean, and also distrust for the administration as well.
Yeah, I think you and I both know the director of the BLM. And so the idea for people to say, my hands are tied. This isn't the end of the day. They're going to say that. This is going to go someplace. Those dots, there's an appendix at the end of the book. We still haven't written our assessment of the book of what it's going to be at the end of the day. They're going to say that. And then they're going to say, trust me, right? Now, if you have a friend that's going to tell you like, hey, trust me, this is all going to be just fine in the end, trust me. But that friend came to the party. And when they showed up to the party, before they told you, trust me, they came in, they kicked in the door to the party and walked in the door of the party after kicking in the door, and then announced to everybody, who they were, but they kicked in the door. It's not the most gentle way to enter the conversation. And I think that to me is the big faux pas here from this, is that it doesn't matter what was in the book. Again, by choosing that as the suggested preferred alternative, you really threw, what do you expect the local population to think? What do you expect the congressional delegation to say? That this is not how you win friends and influence people, by coming through the front door with a battering ram. And that's essentially, to me, what this decision was.
I think, Nephi, you hit it right on the head. The expectation, the way that there is just already a resistance to DC-led efforts in the cowboy state. Wyoming just traditionally very conservative. And then when you have an approach like this, I can't think of any other RMP where I have seen not only the governor's office calling for a withdrawal, but now local municipalities, the county commission. I've never seen that. There's always been, as you indicated earlier, some sort of release, and then we'll work to dial this in to try to compromise and satisfy as many stakeholders as possible. But the way this one has made its debut, battering ram is the right adjective. That's exactly what this has been. And I think that's why we're seeing the traction that it has, the conversations that it's having, and quite frankly, just the outcry across the state, federal and state delegations. Everybody is weighing in on this, and that doesn't bode well, because the unfortunate part, you both would know this better than anyone, but when you tie up a process like this in the courts after this 90-day comment period, this is at the taxpayer's dime. The resource, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's the part for me that, again, we're seeing this more and more, which is in all varieties of politics and decisions that are going on, is it's okay, I'm going to stake out my position on the absolute, and some people might not think this was too far, but a lot of people do. And so if that's where we're going to start the argument from, and that if our position of negotiation is going to be so bad, I went to Tijuana once and it was wonderful. I went with my wife and we got some really cool stuff. And I remember stopping as we're about to cross the border, there was this really cool, a poncho, right? And I'm a big Denver Broncos fan.
It's like a blanket with a hole in it.
Yeah, man, like Clint Eastwood style poncho. I really had to have that poncho, and I looked at that poncho, and I was like, let's wheel and deal. And so the guy said, "Oh, how much will you give me?" And I started wheeling, dealing at $5. And you know what he do? He threw me out of the store. Get out of here!
You're wasting my time.
Yeah, and I really wanted the poncho, and I was ready to wheel and deal. But sometimes you've got to bring that initial offer can't be insulting.
You got to have some credibility.
That's what concerns me about the kind of the tendency of us to whipsaw back and forth between these sides. Like, I think that most of us would look, I'd be like, you can't really be serious about this. Is not really where we're going to start the negotiation, is it?
Yeah.
I'm concerned that we're throwing each other out, that we're losing the ability to sit across the table and talk to each other because that opening offer, it's becoming more and more the norm to have that opening offer be, quite frankly, out of left field, but just different than anybody would expect. And I think one more point I wanted to hit is that what people miss sometimes, and I think that it needs to be noted for those that would argue, hey, look, we really do want maximum conservation in these spaces. That's a valid opinion. I get that. Matt Mead used to say, you can't forget that we're not a zoo. We live here. And for me, that's the thing that escapes us. Conservation is very much a luxury. It's something that we get to do in this country because we're so blessed economically, because we have communities where people can afford not only for their basic necessities, for their rent and for their food, but they can afford to have enough money to go out and hunt. They can afford to have enough money to spend towards an environmental priority. Because when I lived in Brazil and worked with people there and worked in favelas, and I did, those people, they could care less about the environmental quality 10 miles away from where they lived. And we have that luxury of being able to do that. But in order for that to work, what we have to remember is you don't have a local chapter of Muley Fanatics Foundation having a banquet and earning money and putting great conservation on the ground if that community doesn't have people in it, if those businesses can't afford to come to those auctions, if sportsmen's connection to that place is only people who live on the East Coast, because the people who live in those communities have rejected the idea of conservation wholesale because they're so mad about something. And so that's the dance that has to go on, that you have to be aware of as a policymaker when you're creating these alternatives and you're embracing them.
I had two thoughts here. One is, I think there's a mistake that was made. There was a mistake that was made here. But there was also, and it was inviting Nephi, and there was also a huge opportunity.
Was that
here, and it's banning Nephi. No, in all seriousness, I think there was a pretty significant mistake made here, and I do think there is an opportunity. I want to touch on both really quick. The mistake is the lack of engagement and communication at both the state and local level over the past couple of years, because I think this draft RMP being released the way it was really caught people off guard. There was time to bring cooperating agencies and stakeholders back together to talk to them about this. There was time actually for the administration to explain why they were having to select alternative B, why they maybe didn't have the time to go back in and bring everybody together to hash out another alternative, and why. So I think there was this mistake, this missed opportunity to engage productively early on to explain the reasoning behind this. Because I actually think, as shocking as the preferred alternative was to many on the ground, I think part of the shock value of that came from, and you can blunt the shock effect through communication ahead of time. And will people still be fired up about it because of selecting that alternative? Absolutely. But if they knew where people were coming from, where the administration was coming from, and why they were doing that, and then what the next steps were, and how important the next steps are, and this is where I say the opportunity. I mean, there still would have been negative press. The delegation still would have said negative things about it. But that's going to happen with federal actions, no matter what. No matter how much communication there is, there are going to be people that like the federal action and don't like it, and you're going to have that kind of conversation. But it could be toned way down, and you could have a productive dialogue. And that's where I think the opportunity lies now, right? We have a comment period on this that runs through the middle of November 16th, I think, is the comment deadline. And it is, I know, Josh, you've heard this directly from BLM, and I have too. They have told us directly that they need, not only do they want the feedback, but they really need constructive, productive comments and feedback to try and land this someplace that can be workable. Because I think the last thing anybody wants, to your point, Josh, is this giant pendulum swing where we get something and then it's litigated and then a new administration comes in and it swings the other way and nobody has any certainty or durability on the ground. We don't know what's going on. We're just in fighting mode, right? And that's not helpful for mule deer. That's not helpful for conservation as a whole. So I view this as there's a big opportunity here to have all of our collective voices heard. We just can't write in saying we love it or we hate it. We have to write in and say, this little mountain area, for example, is incredibly important. And here are some of the recommendations that we would suggest for management of this area to enhance conservation and other multiple uses. And be as specific as possible. We might be able to comment and say, look, the use of ACECs here is maybe unnecessary, but we agree that in certain places, critical winter range, for example, there might be opportunities to incorporate into the plan stipulations of use restrictions during the most vulnerable times for mule deer, wintering mule deer, or elk, for example. And I think the public would say, yeah, that's reasonable. Those types of things make sense. So it is imperative, the opportunity, meaning it is imperative that we use the power of our collective voices to say exactly the things that we want. Don't just use this as an opportunity to complain or cheer. This isn't time for being a cheerleader or a critic, right? This is an opportunity to provide constructive feedback to get a land management plan that's going to be in place for decades, potentially, in a place that can work for the people on the ground and the wildlife as well, right? So that's where I say, I think there was a mistake, but out of every mistake, there's an opportunity.
I think you're right, Dave. And I think to me, this is why you're 100% right. And it's going to take overlook what we don't like about each other to do it. And by that,
that's going to take a lot with you, Nephi.
Yeah,
sorry.
Dave, you're
sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I couldn't help it. Help it.
It's the whole thing with the party, man. When somebody kicks in the front door to come into the party, they can still you can get over it, but you have to recognize that you did it. And if you're the guy that did the door kicking, you at least can't go to the host of the party and at least say you're sorry and figure it out. And I think that they're trying. I hope that they do that. I hope that they mean that. And I think it would be disingenuous to say that the way that this was released isn't going to have some people who would otherwise come to the table saying, no, I won't come. Because there are people that are going to be frank, there are people that we're going to be willing to come and hold hands and walk down the yellow brick road that are going to be frightened too, because they're going to worry about having egg on their face because they're not going to have faith in the agency doing the right thing in the end. That's just a reality of where it's at, and it's going to take some real humility on the agency side to actually help mend fences too.
And that wraps up another episode of Wild Things and Wild Places. But remember, the journey doesn't end here. Make sure you never miss out by subscribing. Whether you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, streaming us on our website, or following us on social media, subscribing is the best way to stay connected. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for more wild episodes.
Everybody knows I'm a muley fanatic.